The Idaho student killings. Well, now, we know what the police were not telling us all along in this investigation. Well, we're going to talk about that and a whole lot more right here on this Charlie Crimebuster podcast. What some people are calling, well, they're calling it the fastest minutes in podcasting.
Expressed in this podcast are those solely of individuals interviewed and participating in this show and do not represent those of Peacemaker Network and Charlie Crimebuster. All individuals described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to today's podcast. Boy, we got a doozy today. We now have information that we did not have before. But before we get into that, let me say welcome to all of our new listeners. We're gaining listeners every week, a multitude of them, it seems to us, and we appreciate so very much your tuning in. Hey, I'd love to hear from you. Be sure and reach out with a shout out. You might have questions, suggestions, an opinion, and even if that opinion is different than ours, we do respect you, and we want to hear from you. Or maybe you just want to shout out and say hi. You can reach me, Charlie Crimebuster, at gmail.com. That's Charlie Crimebuster at gmail.com. And if you'd like to support the program, well, we'd like you to go on over to peacemakernetwork.com. That's peacemakernetwork.com. There you'll find an opportunity for you to be a part of the program. By that I mean you can help us support others. You can help us support the cops, the first responders, the firemen, and the military, those people who are always ready to help us, even at risk to their own lives. You can support them and support this podcast by becoming a badge, B-A-D-G-E supporter for as little as $3 a month. You can help these brave heroes and help our podcast as well. Go on over to peacemakernetwork.com. Now, don't worry, we got all of this in our show notes, both the way you can respond to peacemakernetwork.com and how you can reach us. It's all going to be in the show notes. Well, to begin with, let me say that we're now taking our hats off. Yep, taking our hats off and giving a good old Charlie salute to the Moscow Police Department. You see, in spite of unfounded criticism, well, this department, they put their head down, they got their alleged killer. Just about everybody, most all, if not all, of the so-called talking heads, well, they were talking about this department. They were talking about that department, Moab, as a special needs child. At least that's the way they came across. They said it was just a tiny little police department. They only had like 30, 40 people. They were unprepared for a crime of this magnitude. Well, they had not had a murder in 7 years. They went on to say, well, this police department, they're way over their head. You heard all those talking heads, didn't you? Well, on our podcast, we're not afraid to tell you when the police do make a mistake. We did not pull punches with the shooting there in Texas, the Uvalde shooting, and the way the agencies out there failed the public and themselves miserably. You remember they treated an active shooter like a hostage standoff. No other way to say it. Yep, they blew it. And possibly children died because of it. Yet I have maintained that the Idaho police was doing an excellent job. Now, they did have some problems, miscommunication problems at first, too many different people talking. The DA, the coroner, they were all talking. And the police did misspeak when they said there was no danger out there when they immediately began to talk to the public. But boy, they quickly reversed that. However, the police, they were really standing tight. They were not revealing unnecessary information to the investigation. And my friend, it was this little department that led this investigation for sure. Now, they correctly relied on any and all resources available to them, including the state police, the FBI, and even the governor, he coughed up some bucks, $1 million, to help in the investigation. But as was spoken with conviction just a couple of weeks ago, and they said it very clearly, the Moab Police Department was in charge of the investigation. They made that clear. And when they got there, they locked down the crime scene immediately. That's when the crime was known to them. And they protected it. Boy, did they protect it and the information that flowed from it from the get-go. Yep, this department deserves respect. Now, I know there are larger departments, and many people thought, well, if a larger department, they would have handled it differently. But I can assure you, those larger departments, well, they would have leaked, yeah. Not on purpose, but they would have leaked like the Titanic when it hit an iceberg. All kinds of information would have come out, some that may have compromised an investigation of that type and could have tipped the suspect. So now, though, what kind of information did the police have that they were not telling us? Because now, you see, that information is made public in light of the affidavit that was used to arrest the alleged killer. Hey, can't wait to get into that in just a moment. Well, hey, right now, it's time for that crazy crook story of the week. You know, we share one every week, just about every week, to kind of lighten the load of the information that we get. And our crazy crook story this week, yep, it comes from just down south of us, just a county away or so. We're talking about Polk County, Florida, and we're talking about Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd. That's right. He held a news conference at the beginning of this month. Well, he wanted to wish everybody a happy new year to the listeners, and then a sad new year for some shooting suspects. He referenced 2 drive-by shootings that was reported in his jurisdiction in 2023. But then he went about and he said, now I have seen some craziness in my life. And he said, told us about a burglary involving a man who Judd described. Well, the sheriff said he's the dumbest person on the face of the earth. He went on to say, sheriff did, so I've seen some craziness in my life, but this is the beginning of 2023, and we've got a lot of craziness to see this year. He shifted that conference to that burglary in order to focus on a lighter subject. He went ahead and told us about 1:10 a.m. on a Thursday. Deputies, they responded to an alarm that was triggered by the burglary of a Dollar General in Poinciana, Florida. Later, they learned from the store's manager, the man had recorded on surveillance video a man breaking into the business still in a cell phone. That man, by the way, had visited the location earlier, the previous day. And that store owner talked about a guy that was identified as Martin Garcia. You see, this Martin Garcia, he spoke with the manager about wanting a cell phone, asked about employment, even took an application when he was leaving the store, and his phone number, he left that as well, according to Judge. Well, there was even a Polk County deputy that had recognized the guy from his neighborhood, so they began to search for him, but they couldn't find him. They were looking all through the evening, could not find Garcia, could not find this guy. That is, until a 911 hang-up call was received by Polk County dispatchers just before 7 p.m. And it turns out, my friend, get this, a woman who was Garcia, she had placed the call while the two were in the middle of burglarizing another vacant home. Now, deputies, they responded to Cardinal Street there in Poinciana to a vacant house with a for sale sign in the card. They were checking the house. You see, that's where the 911 call came from. The sliding glass door was open, so they went in to check it out, and yep, you got it. Yep, there's Martin, along with his girlfriend. You haven't heard it all yet, though. Listen to this now. Garcia, he confessed to both burglaries, Judge said, and the woman with him, she confessed to the latter one. And as for why she placed that 911 call, now Judd had to take a moment. He said, I swear I'm telling you what I was told. I'm not making this up. She dialed 911. Wait for it. She dialed 911 to have a deputy come there to help them move their belongings, take them to the airport so they could fly back to New York. They don't like it in Florida anymore. That's what Judd said. Did you hear that? She dialed 911 from inside the house they had broken into so we, the sheriff's department, can help them pack up and give them a ride to the airport so they could return to New York. Well, Judd went on to say, he said, you have to be from New York to do something like that. And that, my friend, is Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. Now back to our main focus. The police was keeping a lot of information to themselves, and my friend, it paid off in a big way. You see, unless you were born yesterday, you do know that in the early morning hours of Friday, December 30th, police arrested the alleged offender. Arrested him in Monroe County, where he grew up. His name was Kohlberger. That's his last name. Not even going to give you Brian as his first name, but I shouldn't even talk about him because this guy doesn't deserve any of our respect. He was arrested about 1:30 a.m. Friday by local police and the FBI in what appeared to be his parents' home. That was in a gated community, by the way, in Indian Mountain Lake, there in Pennsylvania. Now, Kohlberger, he was home for Christmas. You see, he was a student at college there in Washington State College. That was in Pullman, Washington. He lived there, and he was just about 10 minutes from the crime scene. Now, the crime scene, of course, was near the Idaho State College. Both those state lines are close together. His dad had come home to Washington to help him on the trip back home. That was around December the 17th. So his dad comes to help him drive all across these states back to Pennsylvania. But guess what now? His dad did not have to help him drive back to Idaho, you see. Brian had a new escort, the Popo, and he did not need help to drive back because they escorted him by air, complete with shiny bracelets called handcuffs. And now, through an evidence affidavit, we now have the reason for a probable cause arrest. And that being released tells us what the police was not telling us. Now, there was a timeline that was released by writers and others, but there was so much more in that timeline that the police did not release. So here, let's talk about the timeline now with the information from the affidavit. And we must never forget these precious victims, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chaplin, Madison Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves. They were all University of Idaho undergraduates, all involved in the campus Greek system. And all were friends. Kernodle, she was 20 years of age, had a bubbly personality, junior majoring in marketing. She was dating Chapin, 20. He was a triplet, fun-loving sports management major. Mogan and Goncalves, they were both 21, and guess what? They had been inseparable since the 6th grade. They did everything together, lived together, went to school together, and ultimately died side by side. And it happened on Saturday night, November the 12th, 2022. Well, at first, everything seemed normal. Kernodle and Chapman, they went to a party at their fraternity. And Mogan and Goncalves, they went out to a bar. Then they hung out by a food truck for a bit. And according to the affidavit, about 2 a.m. Sunday, everyone had gathered back at the house at King Road. That's where Mogan, Goncalves, and Kernodle lived with 2 other roommates. Now, the 3-story house, it was accessible primarily by a secure door with a coded entry on the bottom floor, as well as a sliding glass door on the main level of the house. Now, the lower entry was locked, but that sliding glass door, it was more easily accessible. So around 4 a.m. that morning, Kernodle, she ordered Jack in the Box. That's at 4:12 a.m. She was on her phone, surfing TikTok. And sometime in the next few minutes then, that horrible attack began. Now, she tried to fight off her attacker, but by 4:25, both she and her boyfriend would be dead. You see, the killer attacked on the 2nd and 3rd floor of the house, entering each of the victims' rooms for separate attacks. But he left the roommates on the lowest floor alive. And he used as his weapon a large K-bar knife, the same style used by the United States Marine Corps. Now, nearby surveillance, we now know, captured audio of the attacks around 4:17 a.m. That included distress sounds and, barking from Goncalves' dog. And as it was revealed in the affidavit, shockingly, one roommate told police she heard noises and crying. These are the two, who were not hurt. But she really didn't understand what she was hearing, although she opened her door repeatedly to see what was happening. She says she saw nothing alarming, though she did report hearing Goncalves say, "There's someone here." Sometime later, over the sounds of crying come from Kanota's room. Then she heard a male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Now the third time she opened the door, she opened it to the sight of a man, all dressed in black, wearing a mask, walking toward her. And she says she stood in, quote, frozen shock. The killer literally walked right by her room. Now it's unclear whether or not he even saw her. With his face mostly covered, the roommate, she noted the only thing she could see clearly was the suspect's, get this, bushy eyebrows. Now that detail would later prove to be accurate. So the roommate, stunned, shocked, frozen, returned to her room, locked her door, while the killer exited through the sliding glass door on the apartment's main door. Then he vanished. Now I know by now you're all wondering how in the world this one roommate who was not hurt, how could she have closed her door and just went back to bed? Experts will tell you, though, that body reacts to shocking things, in around 3 ways. I call them 3 Fs. Our body reacts by flight, fight, or freeze. Well, this lady, she froze. She went to bed, thought hopefully it was only a dream. Now, someone who works with 911 responders, these are the guys and gals that face unimaginable sights. This person puts it this way. Her name is Coleman. And she says that unless you've been through a mass casualty incident, you may not understand. And she went on to say that a young woman likely wouldn't pick up on the glaring clues that indicate a crisis situation. She says the trauma becomes more difficult to process when it's something so far outside of our consciousness. It doesn't even make sense to us, she said. You see, in this case, no one ever thinks they're going to have this man come into their home and brutally stab their roommates. And I guess, my friend, we should not be too hard on her. You do not know how you would react unless you've been scared beyond anything as incomprehensible as a dark November night that this young lady faced this man in. And at least she has been able to provide a description of the intruder that has helped in the probable cause affidavit. So now, what did the suspect do next? He drove away. Then someone finally, the next morning, 11:58 a.m., they called 911. 911 received a call from a roommate's phone during a time when they were summoned to answer a call about someone unconscious. My friend, there's still a lot explaining about that. We're all somewhat befuddled, aren't we, about that 911 call. So there's a timeline that we were not told about. You see, the affidavit now sheds a great deal of information about how the police knew not only about what happened that night, but how they did take that information to build their investigation. Now, you know what is striking about this investigation is how quickly the police was able to really tune in on a person of interest, and how these multiple law enforcement agencies, many of them together, worked together seamlessly to apprehend him by collaborating, now get this, across multiple states, multiple jurisdictions, even all over the country. You see, the first big lead in the case, it came from a nearby surveillance footage that captured a white sedan that was repeatedly circling the neighborhood. Now get this, between 3:20 and 4:20 a.m. that day. Now they tracked that car to Pullman, Washington, about 10 miles away, which was home to the Washington State University campus. Meanwhile, an FBI expert, he identified the make and the model, even narrowed it down the year range of the car, a 214 to 216 Hyundai Elantra. With that detail in hand, the campus police there at Washington State University, they quickly tracked down that Hyundai. They tracked down the owner who attended the school, lived near the last place the car had been seen on surveillance of the night of November the 13th. Yep, our offender, Kohlberger. And by November the 29th, just 2 weeks after the murders, well, the Moscow Police Department, they had a copy of Kohlberger's driver's license photo complete with those quote-unquote bushy eyebrows that our witness talked about. Then they went into cell phone records. There they found Kohlberger's phone traveling from Pullman in the direction of Moscow on the night of the murders. Now get this, before it was shut off completely between 2:47 a.m. and 4:48 a.m., consistent with Kohlberger trying to conceal his location during the quadruple homicides. You see, this student who was seeking a PhD in criminology, he thought he was so smart to turn off his phone. But even in turning off his cell during that specific time, well, it does indicate guilt. Now, they also showed Kohlberger apparently returning to the scene. Yep, returned to the scene of the crime the next day. Around 9 a.m. that day, they tracked him back to the scene. And that was still several hours before authorities would even be alerted to the scene. And then he immediately returned back to his house in Pullman. Now, while authorities had a strong circumstantial evidence by tying Kohlberger to his white car, well, it appears, I guess, what many people call the smoking gun, well, that too had been recovered from the crime scene on the very first day of the investigation because they found, now get this, an empty knife sheath with a trace of DNA from an unknown male. And now, authorities armed with this information, well, they turned, as we predicted on this podcast, they turned to the groundbreaking technique that's led to the arrests in many cases since 2018, including that of the Golden State Killer. Yep, they used genetic DNA matching. I told you about this a couple weeks ago, that they would use that. That's the process where investigators upload DNA to a genealogy website, build a potential family tree or suspect. Then, using context clues and other practical, good detective work, well, they follow that family tree, and they trace it to the person who's most likely a match. And the police, they were able to match the DNA on the knife sheath with DNA from Kohlberger's father. They gathered that at trash from Kohlberger's parents' home. And that match, my friend, well, it was definitive, excluding 99.99% of the population from being the father of the suspect. So now the trail, they're on the trail. The police are on the trail. The trail is hot. And they're building evidence now for an arrest warrant. And meanwhile, Kohlberger, well, it's time to go home for Christmas. So his dad comes and helps him on a multi-day road trip from Washington to Pennsylvania. And their police are tracking him. License plate readers across the country, they map him. Traveling from state to state, Colorado, Indiana, Pennsylvania. In fact, on December the 15th, get this now, they were actually stopped twice by the Indiana patrol officers in a very short time, twice, for tailgating. And there was a law enforcement officer that told Fox News, said that a task force which had Kohlberger under surveillance, well, they requested the Indiana troopers pull him over just so they could get a glimpse of his hands to see if there were any cuts or other injuries. Now, there is body cam footage of one of those two stops, but Kohlberger and his father, they only appear there for a little short time. On December the 30th now, after surveilling Kohlberger for several days, well, it's time to get him. They got their information. They've got the evidence. Now they have enough for probable cause for an arrest. And so the Pennsylvania Police Department, State Police Department that is, executed a raid on the home of his parents. There in that rural Chestnut Township, complete with smashed windows, broken doors, they got their man. And then, after being extradited back to Idaho, all under constant security, Well, Kohlberger, he appears in the county district court, and documents then related to his arrest, well, they were unsealed by the court, and that's why we have this information. And all that time, the police were not telling us that information. They did say they were making progress. In fact, they were tight-lipped. That had to be driving our suspect mad, don't you think? Thinking, well, in fact, he was so fearful that it was reported that he was putting trash in neighbors' trash cans in case the police were to go through his. You know, I think the most unusual thing probably is how strong the case is against Kohlberger. Eyewitnesses? Yep, they got him. Video surveillance of the car? Yep, they got it. DNA match? Yes, sir, they got it. Implicating cell phone records? Loads of those. Yeah. You see, even without added circumstantial evidence, well, Kohlberger's own obsession with criminal psychology, people would think it would be a hard defense to mount. But this department, they came through. Even Kaylee's father, remember Steve? And we all, of course, we remember him, and we all really have concern for him. We can imagine the hurt. And he had been quite critical of the police during the many weeks, critical of their scant updates. But now, he who was critical? Well, Steve, he has nothing but praise for the investigation after the arrests. He stated in January 5 interview, well, he said, all is forgiven. Then he went on to say this, people think Idaho is so old-fashioned and outback, but these guys, man, they hit a home run. He said that affidavit is impressive. Well, my friend, I guess impressive. It's far more than impressive. The swiftness in which the police managed to identify and then carefully build a strong case against Kohlberger, track him across the country, arrest him, all while working with multiple agencies and somehow managing to keep his identity from leaking to the public. My friend, I got to tell you, that is really rare. It is even more extraordinary given how many victims were involved, how unusual this crime was, how many agencies were involved, how intense the public and media scrutiny was. You see, my friend, the triumph of this investigation, well, you remember now, Kohlberger, he was working the criminal system in order to become a better criminal. Talked about that last week as well. You see, it's easy to imagine, I believe, this case will become a major study for what effective policing can and should look like. So, my friend, every week we pick a courageous person and we give them praise. Well, it's easy this week. Our courageous person story this week, it is the Moab Police Department. Yep, who had the courage to say to the pressure of the press, we're not going to release unnecessary information to possibly taint this investigation. In spite of the press, in spite of criticism from the public, in spite of criticism from even the father of the victims, they stood firm. And Charlie Crimebuster salutes the courage of this department not to cave in. Well, in closing, yes, there are lessons to learn. You see, first, while the world appears to be getting more cruel, well, in many ways, police are getting more sophisticated and using ways to get their offender. My friend, if you break the law, you're going to get caught. But while police may catch the offender, there's a second lesson, and that is this, my friend. It is your responsibility to do your very best to keep yourself safe. Practice situational awareness. That means, my friend, you may have to take your phone and kind of put it away long enough for you to be aware of what is happening around you. Lock your doors and windows with locks that actually works. Use alarms, cameras. Learn how to protect yourself. You see, when I was a cop on the beat, well, most of my calls, my friend, were to crimes that had already been committed. So, my friend, it is your responsibility to keep you and your loved ones safe. Now make it your priority. Well, this is Charlie Crimebuster. Thank God this terrible, terrible, vicious offender has been caught. So until this time next time, I'm saying to you, yep, be safe, be alert. The life you save, it may be your very own.